Good morning. I hope you had a really good Easter weekend, maybe a chance to set some work aside and relax and rest with your family a little bit. Hope you are getting a chance to get outside in the yard, maybe go for a walk when there's some intermittent sunshine. Those things are good for the body and good for the soul. So I hope you're doing well. Miss you guys. Um, So here's the deal. I decided to go a little bit further down the road with Japan and Korea, just kind of looking out to the kinds of weeks that we have left, and just decided it was worth staying on the Japan and Korea topic for just a little bit longer to move us forward into almost modern times with those cultures. And then we'll transition down to Southeast Asia and look at some pretty fascinating cultures like Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam. Today, what we want to see is okay, what's true, after the Mongol invasion fades and the Shogun era begins to fade. What's true of Japan? And one of the things we're going to find is that actually, over time, the Shogun era really became pretty disjointed. They were maybe we would say in chaos by the end of the 15th century. What we mean is basically shoguns were coming and going pretty quickly. We mean that shoguns were not able to exert very much control very easily. And so this this shogun had basically collapsed, although it was sort of still in place in name at least. But really, there was no peace. The daimyo, these important families, these aristocratic families were warring with one another, and it was just pretty constant chaos. There are three leaders that kind of come to the surface at the end of the 1500s that are credited with kind of unifying Japan more than they had been, at least during the preceding era. So titles like shogun are going to stay around, but in the end, there's going to be kind of a sense in which that word itself shifts. So let's take a look at the three that we're talking about. There's first Oda Nobunaga, who he actually seized Kyoto and placed the shogun under his control and tried to kind of reestablish a sense of normalcy and suppress all the chaos that was going on. He lasted about a decade and made some progress, but not nearly as much as the next guy. Toyotomi Hideyoshi was actually, interestingly enough, a farmer's son who had become a military commander. And what he was able to do is take control of the daimyo. And he set up power in Osaka. And this is a little bit more extensive set of control. The daimyo were kind of looking to him a little bit more than they had to Nobunaga. And it's a little bit more lasting. But the one that will really last as it gives its name, or he gives his name to this coming era, is Tokugawa. And Tokugawa is going to be a very powerful daimyo himself out of the Edo daimyo aristocratic family, and he's going to take control of Japan. He's going to actually take control of the title of shogun for himself, and he's the one that's going to really settle Japan out of this chaotic era. One of the reasons I wanted to move forward in Japan is I wanted to actually talk about the interaction between Christianity and Japan, which we start to see in the 1500s, sort of overlapping with these three leaders, especially Tokugawa. And what we see first is European trade vessels arriving in Japan, which the Portuguese started that, and they began trading regularly in the second half of the 1500s. And this is something that initially both sides were benefiting from pretty extensively. The Japanese were fascinated with European goods, and there was exchange of things like spices and silk and all the typical sort of Silk Road goods. And that opened the door for Jesuit missionaries. Now, Jesuit is a group of Catholics actually formed after the Protestant Reformation, and their goal was to sort of refocus on Jesus and mission work, and also, interestingly enough, education. There are Jesuit schools all around the country, universities, but also high schools, and they all have very fantastic academic sort of histories. In our city, St. Charles is actually a Jesuit school. And so these missionaries arrive in Japan, and in the last 50 years or so of the 1500s were successful. They were bringing about conversions by the thousands. It hadn't replaced Buddhism or anything like that. It wasn't actually becoming a majority religion, but it was growing. But there was tension over the way the Jesuits responded to the local beliefs, especially to the local shrines. As has happened elsewhere, these Christian missionaries took it upon themselves to try to destroy the other belief sets, especially through destroying their shrines and their locations. And I actually don't think that was right. I don't think that's how Christian missionaries in the earliest years would have done it. Paul doesn't do it that way when he enters Athens, as you see in Acts chapter 17. I understand the impulse, but it was counterproductive, to be sure, because in this case, it led to the Tokugawa dynasty to actually prohibit Christian activities and eventually strictly enforce that prohibition, later expelling all of the Christian missionaries, the Portuguese in particular. And there was actually a persecution of Christians that came out of this. Christians were basically forced to either deny Christ or be killed. Much like the early church, the Japanese Christians faced that same kind of persecution. They were supposed to trample on the image of Jesus, something called a fumie. And what you can actually see in Japanese museums is you can see these fumies and how worn smooth they are. It's a heartbreaking history. They actually got many Christians to deny Christ. Now, that's maybe a long conversation we should have some other time, but what we end up seeing is actually Christianity being outlawed in Japan. And actually, almost all Europeans were outlawed in Japan. The only exception there is a small Dutch trading presence that was allowed to remain. They were allowed to dock at certain ports only for a few weeks or months a year, and very limited interaction with the actual Japanese culture. The other way that Tokugawa comes to kind of control the situation and bring about normalcy is leaning into this feudal system that was already in place. Remember the shoguns and the daimyos and the samurai and then the peasants. Well, the same thing is still true, but now there's going to be 250 separate territories that were called Hans. And each domain was ruled by a daimyo who would support themselves and their families through taxes. But the way that the Tokugawa dynasty maintained control over the daimyos was called the hostage system. So the daimyos were required to have two residences, one in their land and then one in the capital city. And if they were in their land, their family had to be at the capital city, and vice versa. And so there would be this way in which the Tokugawa leader would have a hostage at all times, able to enforce loyalty from the daimyos. And so this time period comes to be called the Great Peace, because the system brought an end to the constant warring and the tension that was going on. And the samurai during this era were then not really going to war as much. They sort of transitioned from being a warrior class to being a class of managers of the daimyo's land. So the daimyo is in the capital city. The samurai are sort of maintaining the land and the tax system and everything. So there's still kind of a ruling class, a managerial class, but not nearly as much a warrior class. Now the last samurai will still be kind of in place culturally for another couple hundred years, but it does end in some ways their ancient code of honor and military ethics and transition more to aristocratic class. I'm going to call it good there for today. So glad to know that we're able to kind of keep plugging at this one day at a time together. Eventually this week, I'm going to have you do the section review and turn it in for me so I can give you some credit. I'm going to start putting some points in the grade book for you for the work that you've already done. Thank you for your projects. Thank you for the worksheet you did. I'm very happy to reward you for the way you're staying strong and staying in it for these last few weeks of school. You are to be commended. I'm very proud of you guys. Keep it up. And hope to see you in person someday soon. Have a good day. See you.